Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and the offseason is beginning with a bang because Bradley Beal was just traded. Yes, just days after the rumors began to circulate that maybe Washington was finally going to go ahead and move on from him, he has been dealt to the Phoenix Suns, not the Miami Heat, who are rumored to be the favorite team for a while. Instead, he's going over to Arizona to team up with Devin Booker and Kevin Durant in exchange for Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, a handful of second-round picks is what Shams and Woj are calling it, and multiple pick swaps. That's the deal. I quickly want to talk about the return that Washington is getting for Bradley Beal before I get into the specifics of what I think about the exchange for the Suns, because that's obviously the more interesting thing. This is not a bunch for Bradley Beal, obviously. I mean, even though he hasn't been an All-Star the past couple of years, I still think Bradley Beal is an All-Star caliber player. But of course, what Washington could get was limited by his no-trade clause and his massive contract, both of which were the Wizards' fault. They should not have given him a no-trade clause. I don't think they should have even given him that contract last offseason, and you don't have to give him a no-trade clause if you're going to throw him that much money. There was basically no competition for Bradley Beal at that price range. It was just a disaster. It seemed like a bad deal when they signed him to it. It's even a worse deal now because not only did the no-trade clause limit where Washington could trade him, but also it limited the deal that they could get back in return, because Bradley Beal can not only veto a destination, but with his no-trade clause, he can veto a deal. So if there was a team out there that was willing to give up a bunch of assets in exchange for Beal because they really wanted him, Beal could say, no, I don't want you to do that deal because that's going to handicap the roster that I'm going to in terms of me trying to compete for a championship. So it severely limits what the Wizards could do. He's making so much money, so that's also a factor. The Wizards just put themselves in a corner here. It's not their fault that they didn't get much for him right now, but it's their fault for giving him the no trade clause and the massive deal in the first place, when instead they could have traded him years ago and gotten a massive return, probably first round picks, young players, whatever, in exchange for a guy who at one point was averaging 30 points per game, was an all-NBA player. They should have traded him years ago, like me and many others have been saying for a while, but instead they signed him to a terrible deal, held on to him for way too long, and now got basically nothing for a guy who is their best player for years. Also, they did this the year after you have a generational, one of the best prospects of all time in the draft, in Victor Wembanyama. If they had done this at the beginning of this past year with a sign and trade or just let Bradley Beal walk or whatever, they would have been able to tank for Vic this past offseason, and who knows, maybe they end up with him or Scoot Henderson, but instead they got basically nothing for Bradley Beal. It's just a complete disaster and a great example of how to perfectly mismanage your assets through Washington. As for Chris Paul, there's no way he's going to remain a Washington Wizard. He wants to compete for a title. He's 38 years old, and the Wizards are angling for a rebuild at this point, so it doesn't make any sense for him to stay there, and it seems like already they're exploring avenues to move on from his contract, because apparently, according to Chris Haynes, they're going to try and reroute him in a trade, and the Los Angeles Clippers are interested. I expect a number of other teams to be interested as well, like the Lakers. They're apparently one of the biggest rumored teams that really wants to bring him in as their new starting one, potentially, rather than bringing back D'Angelo Russell. I think any number of championship contenders like the Celtics, the Bucks, the list goes on, are going to be interested in Chris Paul, because I think he's still a really impactful player, even if he isn't the all-star, all-NBA player he once was. If you can bring him in on a mid-level exception, a minimum contract, or if in the Clippers case, if you just dump some salaries in exchange for Chris Paul, I think ultimately that's a pretty good move. So I like that possible reunion there. And again, I think his market's going to be pretty big because he still is a solid player. One last ripple effect I want to talk about before we get fully into Phoenix is the fact that the Heat don't end up getting Bradley Beal. They seem like the favorites to acquire him for a little bit, but instead he goes to Phoenix. According to Shams, that's what Bradley Beal chose. And so the Heat do not add a scorer, which is something that they're probably looking for. According to Chris Haynes, they've now pivoted to trying to look at getting Damian Lillard. They think this is the offseason where Dame finally requests out. I don't think it's going to end up happening, and honestly, even if it does, I just don't think the Heat have the best trade package out there. I think there are a number of other squads that could pretty easily beat what the Heat have to offer. Now, maybe Dame just really wants to go to Miami, and the Blazers honor that, but I think they're going to prioritize another destination that he might like, say like a Brooklyn, that could maybe offer them more, rather than going for his number one spot and getting basically I don't want to say nothing, but just not as much in return as they could get elsewhere. So I guess the Heat are going to try that, but I just don't see that working out very well for them. Now we can go ahead and get into what this means for Phoenix. They built this big three now of Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and Bradley Beal over there in Arizona. A really quick switch up from where last season they had just Devin Booker, Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton. They went to the second round, franchise record wins, lost in a bad way to the Mavericks in that Game 7. This past year, they traded for Kevin Durant at the deadline, lost in the second round to the eventual champion Denver Nuggets. And coming into this offseason, it was very clear that they had to make some changes. It seemed like Ayton might be on his way out. It seemed like Chris Paul might be on his way out. And Chris Paul is the first one to go, but I didn't expect it to be in exchange for Bradley Beal. I just did not see that as a possibility until very recently. And now it's the reality. They've got that big three over there. They've got DeAndre Ayton still as well. I don't know if they're going to move on from him or keep him. I could see them keeping him because he still is a solid center, but at the same time, they can move him maybe to bring in a couple more pieces to fill out the depth, which is now a major concern in this roster, amongst some other things. Now, I do want to start off by saying that Bradley Beal is a really good player. I think some people have started to underrate him a bit because this past season, he wasn't as committed to scoring. He kind of took on a new role in their offense, and also because he's making a ton of money, people think that he's just straight up bad because he's making a lot of money that he doesn't really deserve. I don't think that's the case. I still think Bradley Beal is an all-star caliber player, maybe fringe all-star caliber player if you want to be really nitpicky, but he is still really good. And I think adding him to this team is going to make the Phoenix Suns better. I think having another scorer to work off of Kevin Durant and Devin Booker is not a bad move to make, but it does concern me how much money they're giving those guys, the lack of depth that they have, and also some of my concerns with how all those guys fit together because it's not the best. Let's start off by talking about the depth because that was probably the biggest issue for the Suns in this past year's playoffs, where you had Devin Booker and Kevin Durant dropping like 30, 40 a night, and basically no help from them whatsoever. The depth is not getting better with this deal. You gave up two players that were part of your rotation in exchange for one, and I do think Bradley Beal is better than Chris Paul and Landry Shamet in terms of building out your rotation, but now you still have to figure out a way to add some players because under contract, they've got their 4 stars and then Cameron Payne. Those are the only 5 guys under contract for the Suns at this moment. They're going to have to bring in a bunch of guys on veteran minimums to try and fill out this team. They have none of their own draft picks, so they can't go ahead and acquire players. Maybe they trade DeAndre Ayton in a 2-for-1 deal to try and expand the depth a bit, but it's going to be really hard to fully fill out this roster with competent guys. We saw a similar situation with the Lakers a couple of years ago when they brought in Russell Westbrook. They had him, LeBron, and AD, and basically everybody else on the roster was on a veteran minimum, and it didn't really work out well for them. Now, I think this Suns team is probably better than that Lakers squad right now, but again, it's a similar concern where it's probably going to be aging veterans. It's going to be young players that are mostly unproven. It's going to be hard to build out a full playoff rotation, and you're, again, going to be really reliant on your top 3 guys to get things done in the playoffs because there's no real room to try and improve outside of those guys when you're this financially handicapped. And even beyond just trying to build a team in this offseason, there's more concerns with how this is going to work financially for the Suns going forward, because with the new collective bargaining agreement that's about to come into effect, the Suns are going to be severely limited in how they can build their team. There's new limitations if you cross a certain threshold beyond the luxury tax with this new CBA. Things like your first round pick goes to the end of the first round automatically, which immediately limits the value of future Suns firsts. You also have the problem where I think it's, if you're beyond this threshold, a first round pick about 7 years out can't be traded by you. So those are just a couple of things. There's some other stuff like you can't really operate on the buyout market depending on certain contracts. It severely limits your ability to build a team. So the Suns, while in the moment are already going to have problems building their team up to add depth, going forward, it's going to be a continuous issue even more so. And this all goes on top of the fact that I don't really love these 3 guys as your big 3. Now, don't get me wrong, they're all incredibly talented, but the fit is a bit wonky. I've seen some people try and liken it to the Brooklyn big 3 with Harden, Kyrie, and Kevin Durant. I don't think it's really similar to that whatsoever because I like the fit of those 3 guys better, and I think that supporting cast is way better than whatever Phoenix's is going to be because they had really solid guys already under contract. They didn't have to give up their entire roster to make it work. I just don't think it's really that similar. The playmaking of James Harden, I also felt like was a big factor in why that Nets team seemed dominant when everybody was healthy. You do have some solid playmakers on this roster with Bradley Beal and Devin Booker. I think Book will probably end up being their starting point guard, but neither of them are as good as James Harden, one of the best playmakers that we've seen in the modern era on that side of the ball. So I have some concerns about how they're going to be able to operate alongside each other with no like true number one point guard. Again, Booker has shown capability to play the point in the past. He's done it before, but now it's up to him to see if he can do it at a championship level after multiple seasons of Chris Paul being that number one lead guy. You also have to worry about the fact that they still don't have much downhill rim pressure. Bradley Beal can get to the rim, and I do think he helps a bit in that regard, but it still is a major issue. They still kind of feel like they're a team that's predicated on mid-range jumpers and vibes. I also worry about the defense because it was disastrous in the playoffs. You added Bradley Beal, who's not a good defender, and while like Booker's solid, Kevin Durant has his moments as well as Ayton, you have no elite defenders on the roster at the moment, and you're not going to find elite defensive guys in free agency on vet minimum contracts. So that's also a major concern. Maybe they're just going to try and outscore their opponents like 160 to 150 every night, but I don't know if that's going to work long term in the playoffs. They did hire Frank Vogel, who's a defensive minded coach, so maybe he finds some way to make it work. Maybe they trade Ayton and bring in some solid defenders and figure out a way to bring in a big that still helps protect the rim but is also cheaper. I don't know. Maybe they somehow make it work, but there's just so many question marks. And also, all these guys have been kind of injury prone recently. Bradley Beal has not played a lot of games the past few seasons. Booker's dealt with some injuries. Kevin Durant has been injury prone over the past few seasons. So maybe they just get hurt and that ends up destroying the team too. There are just so many things that feel like they could go wrong. I have so many question marks. I just don't know if this was the right deal to make for Phoenix. I understand bringing in an all-star caliber player when his price is so cheap, but the outside factors beyond just the asking price might be a little bit too much for me to really be comfortable with. Maybe I am overthinking this, and this Phoenix Suns team is just going to be really good. They've got three hyper-talented players that figure it out. But I'm concerned. There are a lot of issues and a lot of question marks on this team. It's still a long offseason to go. But for right now, I honestly really don't love this move. I think it makes them better, and I do think they're going to be one of the better teams in the Western Conference, but I thought they already would be if they kind of kept the team intact. Maybe just waiving Chris Paul and bringing him back on a smaller contract, signing someone to a mid-level exception, trading Ayton for some depth. Maybe that was the way to go instead rather than going for a star. I just don't know. I'm conflicted. I've been conflicted ever since the rumor came out, and now that the trade has happened, it's even more confusing. With all that being said, make sure to let me know in the comment section below what you think about this deal, both on the Wizards side and also the Suns side. Where do you think Chris Paul goes? Do you think the Suns are now the favorites in the West, or do you still think it's Denver? Do you agree with me that you're kind of concerned about a lot of these other issues for the Suns? Let me know all that down below. I'd love to hear what you all have to say. As always, please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Helps the channel out a ton. Also, basically anytime any of these big moves are made, there's going to be a reaction video here on the channel, so you don't want to miss out on those. So make sure you hit that notification bell too, so you know when those videos go live. But yeah, I appreciate y'all watching. I'll see y'all later. Everyone say it back.